Hi, welcome everybody to the Dreamit webinar on education reform and what it means for your startup. I'm Andrew Ackerman. I'm the Managing Director in charge of the Dreamit EdTech Accelerator Program. We've got an excellent panel here today. We give people just a minute or two to start trickling in. Before we begin, I remind, well, my panelists are all off mute, so that's great. I apologize in advance. I am fighting a cough. So I'm actually going to take a cough drop before we get started. On the logistics side, if you're joining us now, there is a chat panel. Please submit your questions as we go along, and I will incorporate them into the webinar. I have some prepared questions. I'm going to kick it off in just a moment, and I will try to get to all your questions during the course of this panel. 1 second. And I was fine 2 minutes ago. My panelists will vouch for the fact that I was totally lucid and capable of talking without coughing. But while I do that, while I wait for the cough drop to take effect, I want to turn it over to my panelists. They're going to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll jump right in. Jeanne, why don't you start?
Great. Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much. And hi, everybody. Hi, Romy. My name is Jeanne Allen. I'm the founder and the CEO of the Center for Education Reform, a 23-year-old group that has focused on expanding opportunity innovation in American education so that all people can excel and achieve the American dream. Our focus is on both policy, politics, and public awareness. And so to that end, we work with a wide variety of local, state, and national policymakers on a regular basis, trying to expand and elevate their awareness of the pernicious issues facing kids that many of you are trying to resolve.
So in short, she knows a lot more about it than I do. She's been doing it a lot longer than I do, and she's also been doing the real in the trenches type of work that, you know, thank God someone other than I am doing. So thank you, Jeanne, for being here. Really appreciate it. Romy, you're up.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me at this Dreamit webinar. I am the co-founder and CEO of the 74million.org, which is a nonprofit news site reporting on K-12 education issues. And we cover everything from what's broken in the system, the bloated bureaucracy, what's not working for kids, to all of the inspiring stories, the success stories, the what's working stories. As we all know, there are so many out there that the mainstream media isn't reporting on. So part of our mission is surfacing those so that parents can learn from them and organizations can learn from them. To sort of help change the conversation about education reform. Prior to this work, I spent 6 years at the New York City Department of Education, and so I'm familiar with what it's like to work inside of a district and have the, privilege or dishonor of knowing a bit about procurement and contracts and what it's like to, try to sell to districts. So hopefully I can bring that knowledge to bear in the conversation.
Excellent. And 74 million, it's named that because that's your readership, right?
Yeah, duh. We've been live for about a year, and we're reaching about 100,000 readers a month on our site. We also partner with a site called LA School Report that's reaching about 100,000 parents and teachers in LA. And the 74 refers to the 74 million kids in the US under the age of 18. Got
it. So anyway, I had to ask too, so I figured I'd share that with everyone else. Let's jump right in. So as briefly as possible, and I know that this is probably a half-hour material for each of you, I'd like to talk a little bit about the critical regulations right now that are either currently in place or that are very likely to pass in the near term that you think are going to create entirely new opportunities for startups. And let's start on the K-12 side with Romy. If you had to sum up the one or two really game-changing reforms of legislation that are working their way through the system, which would they be?
Yeah, so it's an interesting time for education nationwide as we transition to the new education law. As you know, for many years, we had a law in this country called No Child Left Behind that had a lot of federal accountability provisions that were very strong and very centralized. And recently, a new law passed called the Every Student Succeeds Act And that law is going to decentralize some of the strong accountability measures that were once held tight by the federal Department of Education and give states lots more discretion over the kinds of measures and policies and assessments they implement. So over the next 12 months, we're going to see an interesting state-by-state transition to this new law, which allows for states to basically pick and choose how they're going to measure schools, how they're going to help the lowest performing schools. And so some of this transition has started already, but you know, as an entrepreneur, someone who's probably looking at more local markets, it's going to be important to stay abreast of, you know, in your target geographies, what the state is talking about and which direction they're going. Some states may end up rolling back some of that accountability, which I think Jeanne and I would both agree is, you know, probably not in the right direction, but other states, you know, may strengthen it. And so how those policies end up playing out on a state level is going to change a lot of the context around what local districts are doing and what the priorities are.
So, and this is to either of you, obviously. So the my understanding is that part of Every Student Succeeds also is they're adding another assessment category. In addition to the current assessment category, there's kind of a choose your own for assessment category number 3. Can you give me a little bit, or give us all a little bit more thoughts on what seem to be the types of assessments that haven't been required until now that some states are considering adopting for, you know, this new reform 2.0?
Romy, you want me to start with that one?
Sure, go ahead.
And then fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
I'm missing something. So prior, and that was such a great explanation, prior to what we've had now, before No Child Left Behind, or what we have now, No Child Left Behind, you had to state assessment for mandatory. So it was one test, grades 3 through 8, math and English. There were plans to extend, never got off the ground. Now you can pick a national or state test to do the same thing. You have to test, but they're agnostic about what test it is. Now, to your point, Andrew, the states may decide and will decide what you want to use. But for example, instead of necessarily MCAS in Massachusetts, they could choose to use the Northwest Evaluation, NWEA. They can't use a norm reference test, a traditional norm reference test that doesn't give you firm, clear results for individual kids. As the only one, they could add to it and use that as well. But as long as you can reveal student data, student by student, and have it disaggregated into categories, what I would describe to the people listening is it's really a lot more about sunshine and transparency than about kind of a top-down, create a sort of regulatory environment that says you have to test this way, report this way, and if these things end up being true, to Romy's point about accountability, we need you to do this and such. So in the early days, the this and such was, you know, on a corrective plan, or kids could have public school choices, or at one point in time, now what you do as a result of success or failure is that gray area that people.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you if you have a microphone that you can plug in. It would help you. You faded out a little bit in the middle of that. So you know, just to sum it up a bit before we move on, there seems to be more choice on which assessments you want to use within certain bounds, and also a little bit more flexibility at the state level about what you do to intervene to improve on those metrics. Fair enough recap, or did I butcher what you?
Would you tell me?
What I said is there's more flexibility on which assessments, particular tests they would use, and then also more flexibility on exactly what interventions you choose as a state or a district to meet whatever gaps are identified.
That's right.
Okay, and by the way, I hear you much better now. So Jeanne, why don't you keep going while we're on turning our attention to higher ed? You know, you don't hear as much about higher ed. Is that because not as much is going on, or just because it's little less politically interesting?
Well, there's supposed to be a lot going on. So two things. One is the last couple of years have been focused very much from a federal government perspective on trying to, and I'll say this as objectively as I can, trying to correct what are perceived as inadequacies or failures in the higher ed system, where I think probably most people listening right now know that higher ed's been much more of a marketplace and decentralized, and the federal government's role has really been limited to support for under-supported institutions, underrepresented institutions, Pell loans, et cetera. There was this pushback on technical and schools tax-paying for-profit institutions over a period of time about trying to demonstrate whether or not they were employing, they could actually, someone could graduate from the schools and being employed. So there was a crackdown on defaults, something called defense to repayment, to allow students who were defrauded by institutions. How you prove that is still a big question mark, to get their loans forgiven. And then something called gainful employment that tied schools' eligibility for federal funds to whether you could prove that over time, the people going to your institution would actually end up with a job. Those things are pretty much firmly in place. There's still some discussion. I mean, it was passed. It's going to affect institutions, as they're wont to do, started changing in response to this potential for coming down the line. But I suspect there's still going to be a lot, depending on who wins the White House, who wins Congress, there's still going to be a lot of push and pull over how much regulation over higher ed. Where this affects...
Sorry, just to be clear, I want to make sure I understand. So most of the action in the higher ed reform space seems to be around for-profit institutions.
It has been. The push back, however, is going to be for this to also apply to other institutions as well. And so that's where next year we've seen the teeing up of the Higher Education Act is supposed to be reauthorized. That is actually overdue. They were busy with ESSA all year, and so they will be looking at how funds flow to students, what institutions have to do, if anything, to account for those funds. There is a body of policymakers and people and pressure to create more control from Washington, and there is just as much pressure, if not more, I'd say, to kind of leave what has been relatively a sound system in place. The opportunity, though, for EdTech startups, for groups working in around ed technology, is to make sure that, so there's some other new ideas on the table, to make sure that anything they're creating or doing that extends and supports and makes higher ed more accessible through digital tools in particularly, or competency-based kinds of learning, badging, credentialing, that those things are on the table. There have been about 5 hearings this last year on issues relating to competency-based education and different kinds of approaches. Senator Bennett from Colorado, Democrat, has actually partnered with Marco Rubio from Florida, Republican, on some really interesting things when it comes to trying to understand and appreciate that online higher ed, giving people credit for things not normally done, would be really should be part and parcel of HEA. I can't hear you, Andrew. Are you on mute?
I was trying to mute when I'm not talking so that it wouldn't interfere. So just to make sure that I'm getting this correctly, like the pressure, the accountability pressure on for-profit around, are you really making people more employable, will in some way, shape, or form, unclear how much, start to extend into the rest of the higher ed space. And there is going to be a tier of colleges that are going to have to prove that they're effective as well, which is creating the opportunities in things like anything that pushes to employability. Micro-credentialing is one of those things that often is cited as a way of promoting employability, all the way through to anything else that shows that you as an institution are actually improving your students' ability to get a job. Fair enough assessment?
That's right, and so there's an opportunity there and a challenge, because the more they look at traditional higher education and how to fix stuff, the more likely, particularly Washington policymakers, I don't care what side they're on or in between, have a tendency to try to make everything look uniform. And so
Uh,
it's going to be important for people who are engaged in creating products, services, or supports in and around higher education to keep saying, hey guys, this isn't the way the world works. I was at an event with Michael Bennett the other day, Senator Bennett, and he actually said this comment that I'd love to share. A majority of Congress actually still thinks that most students graduate in 4 years from traditional colleges and universities.
and just so the level set, what is the actual stat?
54%, I think, was the last. That may be high. Graduate in 4 years, and that's not necessarily just from traditional universities.
So a bare majority, depending on how you calculate it, still do.
Right.
Very interesting. So we're going to come back to that in a little more detail in a bit. I'd like to keep going on there. So we've been talking about this in terms of the new opportunities being created. Let's flip that. So if you're an EdTech startup and you started to get some traction, you started to get some customers, what reforms are actually making your life harder to sell? And Romy, why don't we start with you on the K-12 side for schools and districts? Not that it's ever easy to sell to schools and districts. What's going on there that might actually make it even harder?
I mean, I think the big point right now is that the goalposts are moving, at least for the next 12 to 18 months in some of these states. And so where you may have positioned yourself as, you know, meeting a niche that you sort of thought existed under the old accountability provisions in the state, that may be shifting a little bit under your feet. And so I think, you know, the advice there is just to continue watching the conversation. I mean, from our perspective in our newsroom, you know, we expect this to sort of unfold slowly across the next 12 months for better or for worse. And so, you know, from a business standpoint, I think the context is going to be changing. I think it's going to take a little bit of time for those new policies to trickle down from the state legislature and the state DOE into districts. It's possible that at the school board level, some new kinds of provisions and, you know, policies may need to be implemented to address new requirements or to change old requirements as this ESSA law is phasing in. So that's sort of I think the macro challenge, if you will. And Jeanne, I'm sure you have thoughts on that. And maybe some of the smaller, you know, some of the more acute changes. On the flip side, there are a lot of opportunities, I think, as these changes are coming. So I'm sure we'll get to that. But I do think it's an exciting time to be sort of figuring out your brand positioning, because I think the new law has created a lot of entry points with relations to the tracking and assessment and servicing of different subpopulations, like English language learners, like homeless students and others. So there are a lot of opportunities that have been created, but, you know, the general sort of context, I think, is that over the next 12 to 18 months, there's going to be a bunch of shifts, you know, in the policy landscape in each state, and, you know, makes it a little bit harder maybe from your perspective to go to one state or another state, because, you know, whereas the context may have felt somewhat similar, it could end up being dramatically different as states, you know, adjust to the new law.
So just, I want to point out that, you know, ESSA is the Every Student Succeeds Act that we were talking about earlier, in case anyone was a little bit at sea. So the same thing where, you know, it's the flip side of the opportunity, it sounds like. If there's more, you know, more choice in what the actual goals are, than if you were a company that was well aligned with what the national standards were under No Child Left Behind, and now the state suddenly has the flexibility to, you know, maybe not measure it quite that way. Well, they don't need you anymore in that state. I believe that's what you were getting at.
That's right. That's right. I mean, but there's obviously a positive spin on that as well, which is that the new law allows for much more local innovation. You know, one of the things we were talking about earlier is assessments, and that, you know, there's going to be much more flexibility around how states test students. There's also something called the Innovative Assessment Pilot that's been written into the law, which is going to give states the ability to, you know, try out what folks call next generation assessments. And largely, you know, those are it's companies that are on the forefront, I think, of figuring out what cool, new, adaptive assessments can look like. So that's an example of something that I think, the sort of silver lining of all of this flexibility and local control is that it could allow for much more innovation.
Jeanne, before we turn to higher ed, on the K-12 side, similar assessment of where things are going, or are there any new regulations that are just across the board going to make people's life more difficult, or is it one side of the coin versus the other side of the coin?
Yeah, so let me add a couple of things. One, let me just add that in addition to the Innovation Fund, there is more room in ESSA for EdTech based grants. The challenge for small startups or startups, even if they're not small, is that you've already got, love them, McGraw-Hill, Pearson, other people who are combing through all of these things and trying to figure out how they can make it sound like they've already been doing this for a really long time, so they qualify. They might already be on contracts. The good news, but there's also these long sales cycles, right? So the idea is, first and foremost, advice, find out and watch and keep informed of policy, what the federal government regulations are going to look like. It's being negotiated now in terms of ESSA. That flexibility does exist. There's also push-pull right now. The department is trying to very heavily regulate what's being said, because that's just the nature of the beast. Secondly, at the state level, the drive for more innovation and ed technology out there has created a number of state-based innovation funds. New York, Wyoming, Rhode Island has one. Maryland has a digital learning fund. There's lots of things like that out there. So I think that states are going to be looking at ways to augment those funds they already have, with the potential to combine with ESSA, sort of more loosely configured ESSA dollars. There's also other state-based. Again, I think the really important thing here is to recognize that the play has been in the states, but they've been constrained by needing to look and act the same way. The play now will be much more in the states, in the sense that they will be more open if you tell them that this is part of what's allowed. So the lesson here is knowledge is power. If you know that the state of North Carolina or Massachusetts or wherever is trying to figure out how to work on this right now, talk to them now. Say, we've looked at Title IV, we've looked at Title II, we've seen this program. This is the way we might be able to fit into your portfolio. And that's a little bit heavier of a lift than traditionally going to a district, but the district would take you 3 years to try to negotiate anyway, unless you've got a superintendent that says, all bets are off, I want to break the rules. That's
right. I mean, the land and expand strategy from the school up to the district is probably one that I'd say most of the startups are working on anyway. I want to go through a couple of things you mentioned. So, following the reform, there's no end to how closely you can follow the reforms or not. Are there any single sites or newsletters that you would recommend for an EdTech startup who wants to basically know what's coming around, not be surprised without this becoming a full-time job?
Well, I mean, obviously you've got two people on the call right now that have great newsletters and news sources that are always talking about policy and news, and I think they're important to read. And I really do think that the reason that's the best question is because you can find opportunities for individual schools, districts, or states simply by looking at things like that, what EdSurge puts out. Certainly Whiteboard Advisors is a Washington-based group that does a lot of consulting on a state-by-state level. And so there's tons of data sources, and just knowing where to go is very important. The key then, however, is to know that there's a point of view, right? And so we're reform-minded. We believe in being innovative. We believe you have to really break open the mold or break open the field. If Chicago Public Schools is worried about striking and the district superintendent has no autonomy, then it's not really worth going to Chicago. You might go, maybe I should go to a charter network in Chicago instead. So it's both looking at the sources and then trying to understand the context, which you can't always get from the sources.
So you were too polite to plug directly, but for those of you at home, the website for the Center of Education Reform is edreform.com, and you can sign up for their newsletter from there. Obviously, the 74.org, you can as well. The other two resources were mentioned are EdSurge and Whiteboard Advisor. EdSurge comes, I'm pretty sure daily, is that correct? Or every other day?
Yeah, I think so.
And Whiteboard Advisor, if I remember correctly, comes in about weekly. Is there, in the interest of seeing both sides of the debate, is there a voice of the establishment newsletter they should read just to see how, for lack of a better way to put it, the other side thinks?
Well, I'd say EdWeek isn't necessarily other side, but EdWeek covers all aspects of education. So EdWeek has a digital publication. There's an eSchool News that's very much focused on what districts do. I don't know who, someone gave me a copy of this earlier. I don't follow it that much. And I also missed Getting Smart, Tom Vander Ark stuff.
Cool. Romy, anyone to add, or is that pretty comprehensive?
I think that's a great list. The only one I would add, just for the sort of state and district leader perspective, there's a group called Chiefs for Change. They represent about 17 million students in the country. It's a group of progressive, forward-thinking district leaders and state superintendents who kind of collaborate. And they just recently put out a policy paper about how they're thinking about ESSA. And I just found it instructive myself to sort of hear from the lead educator in the state how they're thinking about interpreting the law and what the priorities are. So that's another group I think that offers a good perspective.
Excellent. Now I want to get to the next thing that Jeanne mentioned, or both, I forget who mentioned it, about grants, both at the federal level and the state level. What would be, if you were counseling a startup, what would be the best way for them to figure out what the different grants, type of grants they might be able to apply for? Again, if there is a central resource that they can, that they can access, and they can see where they fit in, as well as at the state level, and if you have any tips on how they might be able to compete against the Cengages and the other big players who are repackaging their old wine to look like they might be grant eligible.
Well, I'll just say a really quick comment. I'm sure Romy has something to add to this. All the sources we mentioned actually cover that stuff. And so there's not one central repository. It's kind of like EdTech. Just when you think someone's figured it out, there's another source that comes out that has even more and better stuff, and people are hitting it from different spins. But between all those sources, you can get a pretty good sense of what's coming down the pike. If you look at an EdWeek or if you look at an EdSurge, they'll talk about the fact that New Schools Venture Fund now has an innovative school grants program. I wouldn't have known that had I not read that. I mean, I know the people there, but that wasn't my business. So we talk about it. Everybody talk. So you get your 4 or 5 comfort areas, and you can get just about everything you need from there. Once you hone in on a state, let's say, then I'd say you go deeper into the state. You connect with the charter school network, maybe in the state. You look at what the newsletters that the school leaders are reading. The state capital newspapers are usually very helpful in terms of what's coming down the pike.
Excellent. Okay, good. I'm not on mute. I was worried I was on mute there. Let's keep running a little bit with the K-12 side, and we'll come back to higher ed in a moment. Are there any non-governmental bodies that startups should have their eyes on, because they can impact their ability to operate? The one that jumps to mind immediately are the unions, who clearly have a role in the process that can be, could be good or bad, though usually we tend to demonize, rightly or wrongly, where they're coming from. Let's talk about their role, about any other kind of non-governmental bodies that I, as an EdTech startup, should have my eye on, and how maybe I should handle that.
I can jump in. Actually, your question on grants made me think about the important role that some of the large national education philanthropies could play as it relates to sort of early startup funding, and even for some more of the developed startups. Folks like the Gates Foundation, Emerson Collective, we're definitely seeing more of a trend of these philanthropies investing in for-profit EdTech startups. And, all of these organizations are so heavily invested in how this transition from NCLB to Every Student Succeeds happens. It's in their best interests to be investing in disruptors and innovators on the assessment side, on the curriculum side. you know, really, I think there's a sort of a wide open playing field, if you will. Jeanne mentioned New Schools Venture Fund, which is another organization. So I mean, my sense, and Jeanne, you should weigh in here, is that we're going to see higher levels of investments from those philanthropies in some of the, you know, new startups and, you know, disruptive startups that have great ideas around next gen assessments and all of these sort of new policies that we now maybe have paved the way for under this more local control model. So yes, unions, but first and foremost on maybe the funding side, and also as sort of a network to plug into. You know, they're already funding probably dozens of startups in this space, nonprofit and for-profit. So I think it's just good to keep abreast of the kinds of things they're investing in. And, you know, from my own work, I know that this is a priority area for them. You know, how do they sort of continue to ensure accountability? Who's creating the new assessments? You know, how are we going to do all of these new things under the new law? And, you know, it's going to be companies who are the one that are on the forefront of that.
And I would add to that, I think that's great points. And I would add to that something else that I think is helpful for you all and also could be a little limiting, which is as these investors, and these are investors and funders who have invested heavily in, for example, like the XQ Prize, Emerson Collective, launching, you know, a 10 school, these are the best ideas anywhere, to a Walton Family Foundation, to even local investors, that they are partnering with districts or charter school networks to help see results and ideas occur and kind of be implemented. And so, but they're very prescriptive. So there's this great opportunity, but they might say, we really think all schools should look like this, and they should have a blended learning technology that has an LMS and an SMS and a PMS. And all those things are going to be together in one. And you may think you've got a great idea, but they may have someone in mind. And so finding out what they're doing ahead of time is good. At the same time, a recommendation that I wanted to make earlier that I think applies here is we are huge fans of iterating, and you know this, Andrew, and beta testing in the very, very diffuse environment of charter schooling. They're quick, they're nimble, they can turn around. You can work at an EMO level and, you know, go to a Charter Schools USA that has 90 schools.
For the audience, EMO, please define.
Sorry, Education Management Organization. They tend to be tax paying versus CMO, Charter Management Organization, which tend to be tax nonprofit, right? Tax free.
Got it.
And so there's great opportunities in small, medium, and large networks, as well as individual schools, to say, look, I hear they're doing this in New York. What about working with me to try to figure out whether I have a better solution? You get a proof point, and then you can take it to scale. So it's there, and then back to your point, the challenge is you do have unions and school board associations and other people of what we affectionately call the education blob, whose life is about keeping things the way they are, or at least they might be open and progressive, but they're slow. And you want to go quicker. And so you want to educate them and you want to talk to them, but you also want to go, but I'm also going over here where they really want me today.
So let's run with that. And then, Romy, I want you to chime in on this. A lot of the startups, their typical evolution is, we're going to start with privates and charters, and then we're going to start selling to public schools for precisely the reason Jeanne just laid out. There is the perception that they can move much faster and they can make decisions much more quickly, and they're much more open to change. So is this true? True but exaggerated? Are there certain areas where public schools might be the better route to go to start with? What do you think?
That's a difficult question, but I'll try to address it. I mean, I think it is true that you can move more quickly, more expeditiously in the sort of private and public charter sectors. I think if you're at the stage of rapid prototyping and you want feedback and you want, sort of hands-on learning and feedback loops, then working with those schools can be great because, as Jeannie said, they're smaller, they're more nimble. They also tend to be somewhat more sophisticated when it comes to implementing technology in the classroom in a seamless way. That said, you know, every district has a different context for how its budgets and contracts are managed. So it's a little bit hard to say, you know, that one or the other is necessarily better in different geographies. I mean, in New York City, which I'm familiar with, you know, principals control their budgets by and large. And so, you know, when I meet with aspiring entrepreneurs, at least who are trying to break into the New York City schools, I always emphasize the importance of teacher and principal advocates, you know, really at the local level, because trying to go after the monolith of the district in a district of this size is, you know, difficult. And as Jeannie said, the sales cycle is extremely long. So, you know, if you want to try to work with smaller districts or districts where schools control their purchasing, building that rapport with teachers and principals who, you know, who themselves feel that your product, your service is indispensable, is probably the best way in.
I want to ask a quick follow-up on that one. You touched on a very important point. Each state is different in terms of level of local control that a district or a school has. Can you give some examples of schools where there is the maximum amount of autonomy versus some states where it's very top-down?
I mean, off the top of my head, you know, I'm not sure. I think we could probably put together a list. Jeannie, I don't know if you have a good sense of, like, across the country, best conditions versus more difficult conditions in terms of.
Yeah, I think part of it's cultural, Andrew, and I think that's the difficulty, and part of it is legal.
Mm-hmm.
What I like to look at is, all right, look at a state like New Jersey. They, you know, the state of New Jersey controls several districts that took over. Even though they're negotiating back for local control, they have state-appointed superintendents in cities like Camden and Newark. And maybe Patterson anymore, maybe not. So you can talk right to them. They actually work for the state. You get to know the governor's people. You get to know the state superintendent. You've got like a direct route. Philadelphia has there's lots of diffuse authority in Philadelphia, not as much in Pittsburgh. So it's more community-based than it is state-based. I would say it's a pretty good, I've never said this before, it's actually a pretty good bet that if you are more of a southern state, you've got more local control. And local control is one of those words that terms I hate, because it means that you really do make lots of local decisions. It actually just means there's more happening at the district level, and people believe they have power, but at least you could play on that power
Perception.
Right. And use it to your advantage. So
what about big states like Texas and California? You know, the perception I have, and I could be totally wrong about this, is that Texas tends to be more of a top-down state. Am I right?
Yes, and California, the larger states,
Yeah.
centralized control. I mean, you do have county boards of education in places like California, that where the counties, because they're not overseeing all the district schools, but they've been given intermediary responsibilities, and as well as like charters on appeal and things like that, you tend to get to them a little bit easier. But I always say that if you've got a target and you know where something's working and you've got an in, then you begin to literally almost create a political campaign to figure out who best you should be in front of.
Cool, I hear you. We could go on like this for a while, but I also want to turn a little bit back to higher ed now, and have a similar discussion here. So, you know, what are we talked about the for-profit and the trends that are in general coming up in terms of accountability. What are the other constraints on the system? I mean, we don't have to touch on FERPA and privacy in a lot of detail, but those are what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the other constraints on a startup's ability to operate that they need to be aware of, and either meet those requirements or find ways to creatively work around them. And Jeannie, you're on mute.
And are you talking mostly in higher ed or just in general?
In higher ed right now.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest constraints really are how and when your products or services affect their accreditation. I mean, if you're offering something that so it's sort of like the regulatory environment we talked a little bit before for for-profits versus traditional institutions of higher education. There's a lot of dynamic, interesting innovations going on in both. But many may not wanting to try that for the sole reason that you may have something that has nothing to do with whether or not somebody can get a course credit. So unless you can fit into their sort of traditional course credit arena, I think that makes it really difficult. But most of the play in and around higher education is about supports around the periphery. Student information services, creating networks. That's the other thing. I mean, data privacy, while it's a really, really big issue in K-12, the notion of being able to communicate with alumni, for example. A lot of schools are going to EdTech companies and saying, help me with alumni, help me create a better—
At the K-12 level.
Yeah, but across the board, help us figure out how to work and expand our communications down to K-12 and up to career.
Got it. Because I know on the higher ed side, there's a lot of people working on the alumni side, not the least of which because they ultimately become donors.
Exactly.
I wasn't where there was as much, I have not seen as much action on the K-12 alumni side. So it's interesting that you brought that up. So unions are less of an issue on the higher ed side. What other non-governmental or non-federal or state bodies are out there that a higher ed entrepreneur should be aware of and possibly tracking closely?
Yeah, sure. I mean, on a higher ed, I mean, certainly all the accrediting bodies, they're really technically supposed to simply approve you and make sure that you're okay, and then you go off into the sunset. But they're playing a larger and larger role on a regular basis in what they want to see and at the policy level. I think that's important. There are lots of associations. It's not unlike K-12. You've got associations of student financial aid officers and business officers and admissions counselors. And there's a building actually in Washington called One DuPont Circle. And One DuPont Circle for 30 years has been the place where all the higher ed organizations have kind of hung out. And they've, again, tended to be a little bit more clunky about sort of traditional operations, but they're also finding themselves in the midst of a huge competitive landscape. One of the issues right now that's being talked about, I think I mentioned earlier, is this idea of risk sharing. Will there be rules and regulations governing whether or not you take some risk when you give kids loans, when you approve kids for loans, if they don't graduate or if they do default? There's lots of interesting collaborations going on, though, more and more, I think, today than, say, 5 years ago between higher ed and K-12. Mitch Daniels at Purdue has 5 3-year degrees, and he's starting a charter high school, and he wants kids to be able to graduate in 3 years. So presumably, you go to his charter high school, you go take one of these 3-year engineering degrees, and you've got a high school and a bachelor's of science in 6 years.
And he's struggling with the accreditation issue. So if you as a startup can plug into that existing network, you don't have to deal with that directly.
Exactly.
There was a man we met at one of the CER lunches that had an interesting story about how they got around the accreditation issue by plugging into a network of not AP tests, but I don't want to steal your thunder. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
The guy who was doing, it wasn't the AP test, it was the college, Modern States, yeah.
Yeah, so do you want to talk a little bit about that? I think that was a great example of, rather than tackling that kind of wall head on, he found a very creative way to kind of skirt around it.
Yeah, and so the idea is that you can take any of the free available online courses and MOOCs and then take an AP or a CLEP test. And they've also created some of their own courses, Modern States Education Alliance, get credit, show up at a college and say, I not only took this course by a qualified professor, but I passed and got a high enough CLEP or AP test to be able to come to school. Will you give me credit? So it's like online learning on a much more, sort of bottom up.
So if I may just put a little context on that, the challenge was they wanted to provide basically as much of the college curriculum as they could for free or almost no cost so people could proceed at their own pace. but getting their actual courses accredited so that you could take those credits with you and actually graduate, they would have had to go through a monumental accreditation process. So instead, they found an existing organization, which I'd never heard of before, which has testing centers throughout the country. You can drop in at any time. And if you pass that test, you get the credits. And they basically just said, well, here's our course, and at the end of it, you take this CLEP test, and then you're good to go. So they managed to very deftly sidestep the entire issue by plugging into an existing channel. Let's keep going. I want to ask your opinion of this. We talked about private and charter schools being very often the path of least resistance as you're trying to initially get into market. Is there an equivalent in higher ed? Are public or state schools slower moving than private colleges or vice versa? Are for-profit faster moving, possibly because they feel threatened? Or does it, are there no clear sectors that are easier to start with if you're a startup?
So there's actually a great opportunity here. I mean, it's hard to generalize. I mean, obviously, if you have great leaders like a Michael Crow at ASU or a Mitch Daniels at Purdue who are looking for things, and they have people actually literally who have innovation in their title, there's opportunities to engage. There's something called the, Bridget Burns runs it, the University Innovation Alliance. They have 12 members. Maybe a little bit more by now, but universities, Arizona, it's Texas State University, Iowa, a bunch of them, you can Google it, University Education Alliance, I think it is. And they coordinate and convene and steal and borrow stuff from each other all the time that they're doing. A lot of it's in the digital space, a lot of it is in this idea of sort of age and space and grade level. And a lot of it's just really different ways to reduce costs, increase attendance, and increase completion.
Well, I'll add to that. There's another organization called Unizin, unizin.org, UNIZIN, I believe. That's also a consortium of 22 large universities, right? Many of them are large universities. Also a good place for this kind of thing.
And I think more and more those same universities are working with a Coursera, or they're working with an edX, which are the MOOC providers, in taking their professors, online to lots of different people. Again, that's not for credit. That was that Modern States wraparound, which provided the credit for willing institutions. But they're more willing to do that. On the other hand of the scale, which might be an interesting opportunity for EdTech startups, are these small ailing, not necessarily failing, but the ailing institutions, right? Those that, for whatever reason, they're in the middle of nowhere, they cost $35,000, people just don't go there anymore as much, they're under-enrolled, they're under-capitalized, and yet they have a huge history. Small liberal arts colleges and some HBCUs, they're looking to solve problems. They're looking for someone who can show up and say, we've got some new ideas about how we can help attract students or how you can save money, and they're open to conversations. They're really easy to get to the president, to be honest.
So rather than trying to sell to an Ivy League for the prestige or a large state institution for the tens of thousands of students, reaching out to some of the lesser well-known, possibly smaller colleges that have long histories, but who are facing economic challenges, that might be the thin end of the wedge for a lot of the higher ed startups.
That's right.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to be respectful of time. This is technically set to have another 10 minutes. We can go a little bit later, but I'm certainly not going to keep people beyond 3:15. The next couple of questions, just to give you a sense of where I want to go, is I'd like to talk a little bit about the different reform organizations, whether they're nonprofits or what have you, that are out there that are startup friendly on both the K-12 and the higher ed side, that you think it might be worth startups to know about, to get in touch with, how possibly they can work together, what good things they can do for the startups and vice versa, and how a startup really should approach them for maximum value. And then after that, there are a couple of questions from the audience I'd like to take as well. So Romy, why don't you start on the K-12 side? Other, of course, than the 74 million, what nonprofits or lobbying groups should K-12 startups be looking at, and how can they help?
I mean, I think that some of the larger public charter school networks are an interesting entry point, both because they serve large numbers of students across, multiple states and multiple schools, and also because they often have sort of departments or areas in their organization that are dedicated to innovation, to finding, new technologies, new solutions. And so just, building an awareness, I would say, of who those organizations are, like KIP, like Summit, Achievement First, Uncommon Schools, Idea Public Schools, and knowing, where they're based, getting familiar with the work that they do, I think is kind of an important, both as sort of a selling strategy down the line, but also to understand like what are the priorities and what we would call some of the most high-performing school organizations in the country in terms of, serving some of the most disadvantaged students. So getting to know them, I think, is a great starting point.
Just a quick question, because you went very fast, and I want to be able to take these down, and hopefully when we're done, if you wouldn't mind sharing links with me, I'll post it, I'll post it online, or I'll find some way to get it to it. I had KIP, Summit, Achievement First, Idea Public Schools, and I know I missed one or two.
Uncommon, yeah. And I'd be happy to send you a list. Jeanne mentioned this organization earlier. It's called New Schools Venture Fund, and it is, a supporter, funder, incubator for a lot of the work that these charter schools are doing. And I'm talking about the top performing public charter schools in the country. And so getting to know New Schools Venture Fund and where they place their bets might be, an effective way to kind of know, who are they supporting, nurturing, et cetera.
And if I remember correctly, there's New Schools also runs a number of challenges. They choose a topic. I believe the latest one is English language learning, if I remember correctly. There's a challenge in that. There was a challenge in STEM.
That's right.
It's all right there on their website, so it's a good resource. Thank you for bringing that up again. Jeanne, please.
Let me just add kind of quickly to that, and it may answer one of the questions in the Q&A area. So I mentioned earlier that charter school associations state by state are often, not always, always worth knowing that they exist, oftentimes helpful. They know what their schools need if they're in touch with them. Some are better than others. But so those are important people to know about on a reform network perspective. And, Romy mentioned Chiefs for Change earlier, but across the landscape, it's actually a very broad, large ecosystem of people, and it all depends on the state, which makes it a little difficult, but not as much if you've honed in on that community. So there could be a local parent or teacher organization. There's a national group called the Association of American Educators. And the Association of American Educators is a membership organization of teachers who would rather not belong to the union, but they need insurance and they want professional development. And they get lots of calls from teachers saying, what do we do about this or that? And so that's another one. But many of the same places that those early information sources, Andrew, that Romy and I mentioned earlier, will list events. And I'm always amazed, even after having been in this business for a long time, how many new people I meet when I go to one of those events that, we'll often write about or talk about or cover, that are actually doing something extraordinary, and there's maybe 10 people sitting around a room. And so it sounds like really difficult, but it's kind of like you find that proof point, you find someone who wants to adopt you and you really like, and it turns out they can probably be pretty influential.
Well, let's run with this for a little bit. Now, I'll ask you for a similar list on the higher ed side to the extent that you've got it. But let's say in general, I work with a lot of startups, and they found a nonprofit that they think is pretty aligned to their mission. What's the best way to approach an organization like this? Are there certain people within the organization they should aim to talk to first? What language should they be speaking? Should they be saying, hey, I'd love to give you a rev share if you do introductions, or should they take an entirely non-mercenary approach and offer something else of value?
I think it all depends on the organization. I mean, certainly, you've been to our round table, and we have conversations with people all the time and are always willing to make introductions and support people who are doing great work. We also have, membership fees at some point that kick in. But other than that, it really is a real, I have to just say that because I don't want
to. That was Jeanne's way of saying she's going to
make an introduction. But I just don't want someone calling and go, you said you introduced me to someone. Yeah, but someone's got to pay for that logo behind you.
Yeah.
But there are a whole bunch of, I think there are different ways. I mean, first and foremost, you identify the school leader or the school board member or the community leader who wants to make a significant change in the community, and things will begin to unfold from there. And those people, once you have honed in on that community, become pretty apparent.
Okay, fair enough. Cool. So I want to turn now to some of the questions that we haven't had a chance to answer yet, and two of them in no particular order. The first one comes from a startup who has a strong following among teachers. Most teachers use it for free, or it's an optional payment. And the question is, okay, so I have all these teachers that use my service. Where do I go from there? Or how do I transition that into a larger sell, maybe at the school or the district level? Do I get the teachers upsell it to the principals? Do I get long lists of principals and just try to approach them directly? Or go through policymakers at the state or district level? Or something completely different? So what advice would you have for this entrepreneur?
I mean, I don't think there's one answer to that question, but my question back to the entrepreneur would be, have you tested your teacher following's willingness to pay? Because obviously there's a lot of different people who can pay for stuff in this education ecosystem. There's parents, there's teachers, there's principals, and then there's the district. And so I think having some sense of, it sounds like this is he wants to convert this, or she wants to convert this into something that maybe the district would potentially buy. So, how to sort of gauge demand across that following, if it was taken away, if a freemium model was implemented. I think that's important. Having the school or the teacher connect you directly to the administration and being your advocate in that conversation is totally clutch, as opposed to just going directly to a decision maker and saying, hey, I work with a bunch of your schools and teachers. And so to the extent that you can enlist an educator as a partner, I think is, always the best bet. And I think that administrators really do listen to what their teachers want. And so that's compelling. But, there are lots of services out there now that, teachers pay directly for better or worse. And so there's that model as well. So I don't know if that completely addressed the question, but again, the question is, I think, what specific problem are you solving in the classroom, and how do you make your product indispensable to the solution to that problem? And then just really making that case with as much support from the ground level implementers as you can.
Cool. So again, I like to recap it just to make sure I got it and give you a chance to say, no, that's not what I said at all. So number one, there are lots of people who can pay for it, from the teachers themselves to the parents to, of course, the principals in the schools and the districts. But if you are going to make that transition, one of the tactics that tends to be more effective in your experience is actually getting the warm intro from the teacher, rather than simply going direct and saying, hey, I work with these teachers already. Jeanne, anything to add? Any particular examples of startups that have made this transition successfully, and maybe examples where you kind of lean back and say, well, that was clever?
Well, one is there's a guy in a charter school in Washington, D.C., who later his company, you all know, called Learn Zillion. He was working on professional development things in the classroom, and he decided that this was big enough to go out and get support and backing to make it, widespread and available to all schools. But in the process of doing it, he went to friends and colleagues, right? And he went to events and he got it written up. And so part of this really is show up at, I'm going to give another plug that is not so selfish, the New York EdTech Week, December 17th. Andrew and I are on the host committee of it. You'll meet these people, but it's doing what Romy said. It's also identifying and saying, look, I've got something I want you to test. And I'd love to have the principals. I'll buy you all lunch, and I'll have the leadership come and look at the test at the end of the day. It's a very big ecosystem, but it actually gets really small when someone's excited about something. When someone's excited about something, it really spreads like wildfire. But I think showing up at events are really super helpful.
So in addition to getting the warm introductions from the teacher, actually putting in the time on the ground, and if possible, being able to position yourself as a thought leader, getting speaking gigs, writing pieces, and between the two of them, hopefully, you'll get that increasingly elusive resource known as a principal's attention.
I'll give you another example.
Please.
There's a company we work with that we've known that also provided some free kits to one of the educators. And they got proof points about how this is working. And so they were able to then go to their board and some people who've given them some early financing and say, see, it does work in schools, help us figure out how to get it into more. And in the process, again, they start showing up at events, they start telling these stories. People do want that example of something that's worked somewhere else.
So basically having, in addition to what we just mentioned, having either a white paper or the equivalent results to point at that, people know basically that you're for real. Can we just, Romy, you touched on this a moment ago, freemium models in general. Any particular examples of companies you think that have made the freemium model work really well? And if so, can you give a little bit of detail on how they structure a freemium model?
From a school's perspective, and from the entrepreneur's perspective, the easiest thing is just to have more of a subscription where you're not necessarily opting in at phases, levels, checkpoints, so to speak. I think Jeanne mentioned LearnZillion. That was one I was thinking of that sort of effectively has transitioned. This is a nonprofit organization, but New Classrooms.
Before we move on from LearnZillion, can you give, just for the benefit of the listeners, how do they structure their freemium? Like, what do you get for free, and then what do you have to pony up for?
Jeanne, are you familiar with their pricing structure? I am not the expert on that.
I think it's enterprise now, actually. That was my understanding, but
yeah.
I could be wrong on that. I think they started out as providing the service and funding it, but I think they now negotiate across the systems.
Okay, so just in general, I think what would be helpful is when we talk about the freemium model, to give people examples of where the bar is. Like where are the free samples? Like I'll kick it off. I'll make life a little easier.
I have one example also.
So
just this isn't company specific, but across the board, you'll see sort of access to the service or curriculum. But then if you want the platform to collect and analyze analytics for you, that's often sort of where a pricing gate comes in. That's how a lot of the bigger textbook companies are doing it now, that are putting out smaller, maybe more personalized, EdTech programs, curricula, and, then making the sell as to how that data is so much easier to track. And this comes back to ESSA and tracking students on an individual basis, but really knowing how to sell that data collection and that tracking and analysis. That's where I think I've seen freemium most often applied in this.
Free for the teachers to use if the administration wants the analytics and pay. I'll kick one in. I've also seen it where it's a number of seats for free. Up to X teachers in a given school can use it for free, which they often will monitor by, you have to use your school.edu email address. And then once you get above a certain number of teachers, then if you want more at that school, you have to pay. Any other popular models that you've seen, or those the two most popular ones that seem to work for the free?
I think that's it.
Well, and by the way, one of our participants says, Newsela is also a good example of the free to use but pay for analytics and reporting. Last question. I think this was one of the first questions that came in actually, but I saved it for the end because I think it's a good way to wrap up. Any advice for you for either a higher ed or a K-12 startup who's trying to stand out? I mean, there are many EdTech startups out there, and they're from the perspective of a school or university, can't really blame them if they start to kind of blur together after a while. So, for the founders that are on the webinar right now, how would you stand out in a good way, of course, to make an impression, hopefully cut through the clutter? And it could be anything from overall approaches to specific tactics that you've seen work really well for specific other companies in the past. Jeanne, you're off mute, so you get to go first.
Yeah, so I'd say two things. Really do your homework about who's doing what and understand the landscape. And then understand it from the perspective of the person you're trying to talk to. There's nothing worse than coming up to me and saying, can you tell me what policymaker I should be talking to in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah.
As opposed to, wow, I read about Washington, D.C. I'm really interested in what's happening there. I understand 46% of the kids are in charter schools. I know that this chancellor just left. I realize you wrote about the fact that everybody on the city council sucks. So from your perspective, if the city council sucks, there's 47% of kids in charter schools and the chancellor just left, any ideas of where I can go? So that I don't have to educate you. Now that's from a sort of market test. In terms of getting other investors, companies, and just standing out in that crowd, it's getting people like, who write, who lead, who fund, and who are competitors to know who you are by also knowing what they do and who they are, so that you can say, so again, if you take a crowd like New York EdTech Week or the GSB Advisors or even New York City Education Conference, you have to understand what they're doing there and why, and then ask them questions about what they're doing and offer to partner. And so the more you can look for and find connections, the more relevant you're going to be. But don't stay in the background and say, I've got this awesome device that'll help autism go away, and expect everyone to jump on it and understand why that's different from everybody else's autism-free device.
So a couple of pieces in there just to go over. So number one is do your homework. Nothing makes you stand out in a bad way than coming in there and talking and not showing that you've at least done your half of the job. Even if the person you're talking to probably knows exactly what you're about to say, at least you're telegraphing that you know what you're talking about. And number two, getting out there and being very, very, very clear about where you stand vis-a-vis other solutions in the market, because otherwise you're just another one that does something vaguely attached to learning of efficacy. Romy, you're on. What advice would you have for founders to stand out in a good way from all the other startups in the space?
Yeah, this is pretty simple, but if you're not a former educator, I would encourage you to visit as many different schools as you can and just spend time. Most schools would be happy to have you as a fly on the wall. Try to go to ones that are high performing. Try to go to ones that are struggling, different size schools. Just getting a feel for a school, like a school culture, a school ecosystem, as lots of you know from the visits that you've already done, is so different from any other working world. It's its own little thing to be understood really specifically. So that's one that comes to mind. And I think.
So quick question, who do you ask for that? The teacher, the principal, the vice principal? Who do you ask for a ride along?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to get into a school is if you know someone, ask for an introduction, a teacher friend who might let you sit in the back of their classroom for a few hours and take notes. If not, try calling a school and just saying, I'm working on an education product. Could I come in and, no selling, just want to sort of see what you guys are up to, and it might take a little bit of persistence, but I think, I feel like most schools would be open to that. And then The other thing, and this really just builds on what Jeanne has said, is, understanding all of the different inputs that educators are thinking about in their own classrooms, which is that education has a neuroscience component. Education has an economic component. It has a poverty component. There are all of these different strands that are coming together inside of a school that people are thinking about. Results, student achievement is that's your best pitch, of course. But I think, as Jeanne said, knowing the context, the sort of policy landscape and what's going on, but also just having a strong understanding of how is what I'm doing also fit into this larger sort of kids first, how we're thinking about helping kids move forward, generally speaking, is really, really important. And so, personally, I find some of the sort of neuroscience of all of this and why certain products and approaches work to be so interesting. And I think there's a lot of research being done on that front. But just getting what's going on in a school, that's my kind of main message. And I think, I'd be happy to sort of, if folks are in the New York City area, try to introduce you to the extent I can. But I think that's key.
So even aside from anything that you might learn specific, just understanding how people talk about education topics, so at least you're speaking the same language. And that's another way of subtly telegraphing that you're in the know, you're not some clumsy outsider. I'm going to, I said I was going to try to keep this brief because I want to keep it brief and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, panelists and attendees. So we're going to call here, even though we have lots of additional questions. What the panelists, I'm going to ask you guys to do in the couple hours or day to follow is, please, to the extent that we talked about, different organizational bodies, reform bodies, or resources like newsletters, please shoot me via email those lists and I'll compile them and I will try to get them out along with a recording of this webinar. And we'll try to post those up there for everybody's reference. So thanks again, Jeanne. Thanks again, Romy. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for everyone in the audience who came. My apologies that we went a little over. My apologies also that we don't have another hour to keep going. Thank you, and I hope to see you all again at webinars next week and the week after. So thanks again.
Thanks again.
Goodbye for now.